Her husband threw her out in the rain with a suitcase and a broken heart. A passing mafia boss saw her, stopped his car, and simply said, "Come with me." She thought it was just one desperate night. What she didn't know? He had been looking for someone real his entire life, and she had just walked straight into his world. The suitcase had a broken wheel. Emma noticed it the moment she dragged it down the front steps, that pathetic scraping sound against the wet pavement, like the universe wanted to make sure her exit was as undignified as possible. She almost laughed. Almost. Behind her, the door to the house she had lived in for 6 years slammed shut with the kind of finality that doesn't need words. But the words had already been said, all of them, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, if any of them had cared to listen through the rain. "You are useless, Emma. You understand that? Useless." Her husband, ex-husband she supposed now, had said it the way people announce the weather, casually, like it was simply a fact about the world. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. Chicago at midnight in November is not a city that apologizes for itself. The wind cuts through you like it has somewhere better to be. The rain doesn't fall so much as attack. And the streets downtown, all glass towers and yellow headlights bleeding into wet asphalt, make a person feel very, very small. Emma Carter was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in architecture that she had never fully used because Daniel had needed her available. She had friends she had slowly stopped calling because Daniel had found them distracting. She had a dream of opening her own design studio that she had folded up and tucked away so many times it had stopped feeling like hers. And she had believed, truly, faithfully believed, that the one thing she couldn't give him was her fault. Infertile. The word his mother had used tonight like a verdict, like Emma was a product being returned. 3 years of appointments, of injections, of silent drives home from clinics where she stared out the window and told herself to be stronger. 3 years of watching Daniel's disappointment curdle into resentment and then into cruelty so slow she hadn't noticed it happening until she was already buried under it. And tonight, on the evening of his mother's birthday dinner, because of course it had to be then, in front of everyone, Daniel had simply said, "I want a divorce, and I want you out of my house tonight." Not his house. Their house. Except it had never really been hers, had it? Emma stopped walking. She wasn't sure how long she'd been moving or how far she'd gone. She was somewhere in the financial district, she thought. The buildings here were too tall and too indifferent. Her feet hurt. The broken suitcase wheel was now making a sound like a dying animal, and the rain had soaked through her coat completely, which meant her dress underneath was also wet, which meant she was standing in the middle of a Chicago street at midnight in a cocktail dress, looking like a woman the world had chewed up and forgotten to spit out neatly. She had $42 in her purse. Her credit cards were joint accounts she hadn't thought to use before Daniel inevitably froze them. Her mother was 3 states away and sick. Her closest friend had moved to London last spring. For the first time that night, Emma felt the tears come. Not the quiet, dignified kind, but the ugly animal kind that she had been pressing down for hours. She stood on the pavement and let them fall, because there was no one to see her, and nowhere to be, and nothing left to hold back for. That was the exact moment the convoy appeared. 3 black SUVs moving in formation through the empty street, unhurried and silent except for the low growl of their engines. They slowed as they reached her. Then they stopped. Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand and stared. The rear door of the middle vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was tall, not in an obvious way, but in the way that made you recalibrate the space around him the moment he entered it. Dark coat, dark hair slightly damp from the rain, and eyes that took her in with an expression that wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity either. It was something more like recognition, which made no sense because she had never seen this man in her life. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, You don't have options tonight. Come with me. His voice was low and even, not a threat, not quite an invitation. Something in between, the tone of a man who was used to the world arranging itself according to what he said next. Emma should have run. Any sensible woman would have. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Who are you?" The faintest shift crossed his face, not quite a smile. "Alexander Kane," he said, "and you're standing in the rain with a broken suitcase and nowhere to go." He glanced down at the wheel, then back at her. "I think the introductions can wait." He stepped aside and held the car door open, and Emma Carter, 31 years old, soaking wet, with $42 and a crumbling life, made the decision that would change absolutely everything. She got in. She woke up not knowing where she was. That half-second of pure disorientation, ceiling too high, sheets too soft, light coming from the wrong direction, was enough to send her upright with a gasp. Then the previous night landed on her all at once. Daniel, the rain, the man with the quiet voice and the black convoy. Emma sat still and let the room come into focus. It was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows ran the entire length of one wall, and beyond them, Chicago glittered in early morning gray. All silver skyline and low cloud, the lake a dark smudge in the distance. The furniture was sparse and expensive in the way that never needed to announce itself. No clutter, no personality, just clean, deliberate space. A guest room, clearly. Her ruined cocktail dress had been replaced by a folded set of clothes on the chair near the bed. Plain gray sweatpants, a white shirt, both unworn. Her suitcase stood near the door, the broken wheel propped against the wall beside it, as if someone had quietly assessed the damage and decided it was beyond saving. She found a bathroom, washed her face, and changed. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and gave herself 30 seconds to feel the full weight of where she was. A stranger's penthouse. A man she'd never met before last night. No phone charger, 9% battery, and nowhere to actually go. 30 seconds. Then she stood up and walked out. The main living space was vast and unsettlingly calm. Pale stone floors, dark furniture, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used emotionally. The city sprawled beyond every window like a painting nobody had asked for but couldn't ignore. Alexander Kane was already awake. He was standing at the far end of the room near a low table set with coffee and breakfast, still fully dressed, or perhaps dressed again. She couldn't tell if he was the kind of man who slept at all. He was reading something on a phone, and he didn't look up when she walked in, which somehow made her feel less like a guest and more like something he'd already accounted for. "Sit," he said, not rudely but not warmly, just efficiently. She sat. She poured her own coffee because waiting felt weak, and she was finished with feeling weak. He put the phone down and looked at her. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe. The kind of face that had been through things, but hadn't let them leave obvious marks. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that moved like they were always calculating something just behind the conversation. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like a woman who got into a stranger's car at midnight," Emma said. "So, various things." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but close to it. "You're not in danger," he said. "I didn't say I was afraid," she replied. "I said I got into a stranger's car. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he set both hands flat on the table and said, "I have a proposal." Emma put her cup down slowly. "I'm listening." "I need a wife." The word landed like a stone dropped in still water. "Legally," he continued before she could react, "a marriage on paper. 1 year. After which, we dissolve it cleanly, you walk away with financial independence, and we never have to see each other again if that's what you prefer." He said all of it the same way someone might explain a business contract. Measured, precise, already moving past the part where most people would need a moment. In return, you get full protection, access to a private account in your name, and time to rebuild whatever you want to rebuild." Emma stared at him. "You pulled over in the middle of the night for a woman crying on the street, and your first thought was marriage?" "My first thought," he said, "was that you needed somewhere to sleep. This morning's thought is the proposal." "Those are very different thoughts to have 12 hours apart." "I work quickly." She leaned back in her chair. Part of her brain, the part that had survived 6 years of being told she was irrational, was cataloging everything. The exits, the tone of his voice, the way he hadn't moved closer or tried to make her feel indebted for the room and the breakfast. He was being deliberate about the space between them. She noticed that. "Why?" she asked. "What do you actually get out of this?" For the first time, he hesitated, just briefly. "My empire, as certain people call it, is under legal pressure," he said. "Rivals are attempting to use asset seizure laws designed for unmarried proprietors. A legal spouse complicates that significantly." He paused. "There's also the matter of public positioning. I have business interests that operate better when I appear settled, stable, less like a headline." Emma absorbed this. "So you need a human shield?" "I need a partner with enough composure to stand beside me without flinching," he corrected. "Last night, soaking wet in a street with nothing, you didn't flinch when you got in that car. That's not nothing." She looked out at the city for a moment. She thought about Daniel's face when he'd said the word useless. She thought about her mother-in-law's eyes, dry, satisfied. She thought about the fertility clinic waiting room where she'd spent so many afternoons convincing herself that she was still a whole person. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "Respect and honesty. Always. I don't care what else this is. I don't care if it's a transaction, a strategy, a legal arrangement. But I will not spend another year of my life being managed or lied to by a man who thinks I exist for his convenience." Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised. "Can you agree to that?" Alexander Kane looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he said, "Yes." Not easily, not as a formality, as a decision. Emma nodded once. "Then I'll do it." Neither of them reached across the table. There was no handshake, no smile, nothing ceremonial. Just two people who had each, for their own buried reasons, run out of other options. But as Emma lifted her coffee cup again and looked out at the sprawling Chicago skyline, a thought slipped in sideways, quiet, uninvited, and specific enough to unsettle her. He had said rivals were exploiting legal loopholes. He had said certain people called it an empire. He had not said what that empire actually was, and she had agreed before asking. She filed that thought away carefully, the way you fold something sharp inside cloth to carry it without cutting yourself. There would be time to ask the right questions. She was still learning which ones those were. Across the table, Alexander Kane picked up his phone again and made a call, short, quiet, in a language she didn't catch. When he hung up, he said, without looking at her, "We marry tomorrow." Emma set her cup down. "That," she said, "is fast even for you." The almost smile again. "You'll get used to the pace." She wasn't sure if that was a warning or a promise. Knowing him, she suspected it was both. Nobody dreams of getting married at City Hall on a Tuesday morning in November. But then Emma hadn't been dreaming much lately. She'd been surviving. And survival, she was learning, had its own strange momentum. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took 11 minutes. A clerk with reading glasses and a mild expression that suggested he had seen everything led them through the legal language at the pace of someone who had somewhere else to be. Alexander stood beside her in a dark suit that fit the way expensive things always do, like it had been made specifically for this version of him. Emma wore the best thing she'd found in her suitcase, a deep navy dress she'd originally packed for Daniel's office Christmas party. She almost laughed at that. Almost. 2 witnesses. Marcus Webb, Alexander's lawyer, a compact, watchful man in his 50s who looked at Emma the way accountants look at new line items, calculating her risk before her worth. And Dara Singh, his security chief. Tall, quietly formidable, with a scar along her jaw and the kind of stillness that only came from having been in very dangerous rooms and always being the most prepared person in them. Neither of them smiled during the ceremony. Neither of them objected to it either. When the clerk said, "You may sign," Alexander signed first, efficient, no hesitation, and slid the document to Emma. She looked at the line. Emma Kane. Something about seeing it printed there, even in plain municipal font, made her throat tighten briefly. She signed. They walked out into the cold November air as a legally married couple. Alexander held the door. Emma noticed he waited for her to go first, not as performance, just as habit. She filed that away, too. In the car back, he handed her a phone, brand new, already set up. "Your previous number can be traced," he said. "This one can't." Emma looked at it. "By whom?" "People who want to know your location." "And this phone, does it also track my location?" He glanced at her. "Yes." She appreciated the honesty enough to keep the phone. The private club was called Harrow and Stone, though no sign announced this anywhere on the building's exterior. It occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower in River North, accessible only by a private elevator, requiring a code that changed every 48 hours. The kind of place that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. The kind of place where the guest list was a form of currency. Emma knew this world existed. She had designed lobbies for buildings that housed people who lived in it, but she had never been inside it. The elevator doors opened into a low-lit room that smelled of cedar and old money, and something harder to name. Ambition, maybe, or its aftermath. The crowd was perhaps 80 people, distributed across the space with the studied casualness of those who had practiced being seen without appearing to try. Gowns, dark suits, conversations happening in clusters that occasionally glanced outward to assess who was arriving. Every single head turned when Alexander Kane walked in. Not all at once. It rippled, a sequence of small adjustments, drinks lowered slightly, voices dimmed, eyes tracking. And then they noticed the woman beside him. Emma kept her shoulders level and her expression neutral. She had spent 6 years attending Daniel's corporate dinners, where the game was always to look comfortable even when you weren't. She could do this. She told herself she could do this. Alexander placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, not possessive, not stiff, just present, a signal to the room. She's with me. The touch lasted about 4 seconds, and then he withdrew it, which she found both considerate and oddly disorienting. He introduced her to 3 people in the first 10 minutes. A city alderman with a handshake that lasted slightly too long, a woman named Vivian Cho, who ran what she called an import consultancy, and who looked at Emma the way jewelers look at stones they're deciding whether to trust, a tall man with silver hair, Lorenzo Reyes, who kissed Emma's hand and said, in accented English, "Kane, you've been keeping secrets," while smiling in a way that didn't fully reach his eyes. "Recent development," Alexander said smoothly. Emma smiled and said nothing, because saying nothing was often smarter than anything you could say, and because every instinct in her body was quietly whirring. These people were not just wealthy, they were weighted, the kind of weight that came from operating outside the boundaries most people never thought to question. She could feel it, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She excused herself to get a drink she didn't particularly want, and took 45 seconds alone at the bar to breathe. That was when the man appeared beside her. He was unremarkable in a very deliberate way. Medium height, pleasant face, the kind of man designed to not be remembered. He ordered a drink and said, without looking at her, "Mrs. Kane, Congratulations on the marriage. Very sudden. Emma looked straight ahead. Most good things are. He's a complicated man to be married to, the man said conversationally. People close to him tend to find themselves in complicated situations. Is that a warning or an observation? A friendly introduction. He picked up his drink. My employer would love to have coffee with you sometime, without your husband, just to talk. He feels you might find the conversation clarifying. Emma turned to look at him fully for the first time. She kept her voice very even. Tell your employer I take my coffee with my husband's full knowledge of where I am. But thank you. The man smiled pleasantly and melted back into the crowd. Emma turned to find Alexander already 3 feet away, watching. He hadn't moved toward her. He hadn't intervened. He simply stood there with a drink in his hand and an expression that was measuring something. She walked back to him without rushing. That man works for someone named Petrov, Alexander said quietly when she reached him. Mid-level. They send people like him to test new variables in a situation. I'm the variable, Emma said. You were. Past tense. His eyes moved briefly across the room to where the man had disappeared. You handled it correctly. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a grating. They stayed another hour. Emma played the role, attentive, composed, present without being performative. She laughed at the right moments and deflected personal questions with the skill of someone who had spent years managing difficult dinner parties. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over what the man at the bar had said. People close to him tend to find themselves in complicated situations. In the elevator going down, she stared at their reflection in the mirrored doors. 2 strangers standing side by side with matching last names and no shared history. Alexander, she said. The man at the bar mentioned his employer would find our conversation clarifying. She paused. What exactly would I need to be clarified about? He was quiet for 2 full seconds. More than you currently know, he said. The elevator opened. He walked out first this time, and Emma stood there for just a moment, watching him go, with the distinct and settling feeling that she had signed her name to something far larger than a document in a clerk's office. The question was no longer whether the danger was real. It was how much of it he already knew and hadn't told her. The estate didn't look like a fortress. That was the first thing Emma noticed as the car turned through the iron gates and the main house came into view. A sprawling gray stone property set back from the road behind mature trees and manicured grounds. It looked like the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines, with captions like, "Understated elegance" and "A home that breathes." It looked, in other words, like somewhere a normal person might actually live. Then she counted the cameras, 14 visible ones on the exterior alone, motion sensors along the fence line, 2 guards at the gate who hadn't been visible from the road but materialized the moment the car slowed, and Dara Singh, already standing at the front entrance with a tablet in hand and the expression of someone who had a schedule and intended to keep it. Welcome to the estate, Dara said, with exactly the warmth of someone reading from a document. I'll walk you through the protocols before you settle in. Emma looked at Alexander. She runs security, he said simply. Listen to her the way you'd listen to me. Then he walked inside and disappeared, which Emma was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He delivered information and then removed himself from the reaction to it. It was either very disciplined or very avoidant. Possibly both. Dara was thorough. Emma would give her that. The briefing took 2 hours and covered the estate's layout with the precision of a military operation. The west wing was Emma's, the east wing was Alexander's. The ground floor was shared. Kitchen, library, a formal sitting room that no one appeared to actually sit in. The basement level was not discussed, and when Emma asked about it, Dara simply moved to the next item on her tablet. The rules were delivered without apology. No leaving the estate without security. No contact with her previous social circle until further notice. Her old phone number was already being monitored by Petrov's people, which explained the new phone. No photographs shared externally. No discussing Alexander's business arrangements with anyone, including staff. The staff, Dara noted, were vetted. But vetted didn't mean trusted. There was a difference. "Who do I trust then?" Emma asked. Dara considered this with what appeared to be genuine thought. "Me, Marcus Webb, and your own instincts, if they're sharp." She paused. "Are they sharp?" "Sharp enough," Emma said. Something close to approval moved across Dara's face. "Good." The first full day at the estate, Emma did what she always did when adjusting to an unfamiliar space. She mapped it. Not literally, though her architect's brain was already noting sightlines and structural quirks. She walked every room she was permitted access to. She opened every door that wasn't locked. She sat in different chairs at different times of day to understand where the light went. She was doing this, sitting in the library at dusk, watching the winter light go gold through the tall windows, when she found the ledger. It wasn't hidden. It was on a shelf between two books on urban planning, which is probably why it looked invisible to anyone who wasn't an architect with a habit of reading spines. A plain, cloth-covered notebook with no label. She opened it. It was a record of donations. Handwritten, methodical, going back 4 years. Amounts, dates, recipient organizations, homeless shelters in the South Side, a women's legal aid nonprofit, 3 anonymous grants to a children's hospital, a recurring monthly payment to something called the Meridian Worker Fund, which, when Emma looked it up on her phone later that night, turned out to be an organization providing legal support and emergency housing to undocumented workers caught in labor exploitation. None of it was in Alexander's name. All of it was routed through a shell company she had to trace across 4 linked searches to even connect to him. She put the ledger back exactly where she'd found it. She didn't mention it. Not yet. But she thought about it for the rest of the evening. This man who ran what everyone around him called an empire, who accepted without correction the fear his name generated, who maintained the kind of controlled coldness that kept people at a careful distance, and who, quietly and without any audience, spent considerable amounts of money making sure vulnerable people didn't fall through the cracks the city left open. It didn't make him good. She knew that. Complicated people did good things too, and it didn't cancel out the rest. But it made him more, which was harder to hold at arm's length than she would have preferred. On the second day, she saw the other side of it. A man arrived at the estate mid-morning. Mid-40s, heavy-set, the kind of nervous that lived in the hands. He was shown into a room off the main hall that Emma had assumed was a storage room, but was clearly a meeting room of some kind. She didn't hear what was said, but 40 minutes later, when the man left, 2 of Alexander's men were behind him, and the man's nervous energy had transformed into something quieter. Resignation, maybe, or fear without anywhere to put itself. That afternoon, she asked Dara casually who the visitor had been. "A supplier," Dara said without inflection, "who made an agreement and then changed his mind about honoring it." "And now?" "And now," Dara said, "he's changed his mind back." Emma let that sit. She didn't ask what the agreement was. She was learning, slowly, specifically, which questions had ceilings and which ones opened floors. On the third day, she ran into Alexander in the kitchen at 6 a.m. He was making coffee with the focused silence of a man who considered it a task worth doing properly. He didn't appear startled to see her. She was beginning to suspect very little startled him. "You found the ledger," he said, without turning around. Emma stopped in the doorway. "How do you know that?" "The library has a camera. I reviewed the footage last night." She absorbed that. "So you watched me find it, and then what? Waited to see if I'd bring it up?" "I waited to see if you'd confront me about it or file it away." He turned then, leaning against the counter with his coffee cup. "You filed it away, which means you understand nuance. That's useful." "I'm not here to be useful," Emma said, and was surprised by how level her voice came out. "We have an arrangement. Nuance is just how I think." He looked at her, one of those long, measuring looks she was accumulating like a collection of small puzzles she hadn't yet solved. "The donations," she said then, because she'd waited long enough. "The Meridian Fund. The hospital grants. Why anonymous?" "Because the moment my name is attached to something charitable," he said, "people assume it's a cover for something else." "Is it?" "No." He said it flatly, tired almost. The tiredness of someone who had answered a version of that question too many times inside their own head. "Sometimes it's just a thing a person does." Emma stood in the doorway of his kitchen in the gray early morning and looked at a man she couldn't fully see yet. "Okay," she said. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen island without waiting to be invited. He turned back to the window. Neither of them spoke for a while, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less guarded, like two people in a room who had decided, without quite agreeing to it, to stop performing distance quite so hard. Outside, the estate grounds were silver white with frost. Inside, something small and careful had shifted. Emma noticed it the way she noticed everything now, quietly, precisely, and without letting on. The dress was not her choice. It arrived in a garment bag on the morning of the gala, deep burgundy, long, understated in the way that costs a significant amount of money to achieve. A note from Dara. "Appropriate for the evening. Heels in the box. Car at 7. No question mark anywhere in the message. Dara, Emma had come to understand, didn't deal in question marks. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror and tried not to feel like she was being costumed for someone else's production. She mostly failed. Alexander was waiting in the foyer when she came downstairs. He looked at her once, not the way Daniel used to, assessing, cataloging, finding the thing to correct, but the way you look at a problem you've already solved and are confirming your own answer. Efficient. Settled.
"You'll be seated beside me the whole evening," he said. "If anyone approaches you without me present, you remember what I'm about to tell you."
"I'm listening."
"Smile. Keep it short. Say you're still settling in and don't know the details of Alexander's work." He paused. "Both of those things are true, so it shouldn't be difficult."
Emma almost smiled herself. "You're very good at technically honest instructions."
"It's a skill," he said without irony.
The gala was held in the Grand Meridian Ballroom, a venue so aggressively gilded it felt like a rebuke to minimalism. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, round tables draped in ivory, each centered with floral arrangements that cost more than Emma's first month's rent in her 20s. A full orchestra in the far corner playing music designed to make you feel like your life had a score. It was a fundraiser for the Chicago Children's Medical Foundation. Legitimate, prominent, attended by the kind of people whose photographs appeared in newspapers, with captions that said things like, "philanthropist," without specifying the source of the philanthropy. And it was, Emma realized within 20 minutes of arriving, also a room full of people who wanted things from Alexander Kane, or wanted to know what he knew, or wanted to neutralize what he represented, depending on which side of the room's invisible dividing line they stood on. She watched him work it, because work was the right word. Every conversation he had was a calibrated exchange, a measure of information given, a measure extracted, nothing wasted, nothing unintentional. He was charming when the situation required it, which surprised her because charm was not what she would have listed among his characteristics. But there it was, low, dry, precise, deployed sparingly enough that the people it was aimed at felt specifically selected, which they were. Emma played her role. She smiled. She deflected. She made exactly 2 comments about Chicago architecture that landed well with 2 separate people and made her feel, briefly, like herself again. She drank 1 glass of champagne slowly and watched the room the way Dara had reminded her to on the drive over. Don't just be seen. See. She was doing exactly that, tracking a man near the back of the room who had now changed his position 3 times while facing their table, when she felt someone settle into the empty chair beside her that Alexander had vacated 60 seconds earlier to speak to the Foundation's director. She turned. The woman was 50s, elegant, silver-haired in a way that read as intentional power rather than age. She wore a smile that had been practiced into flawlessness.
"Emma Kane," the woman said pleasantly. "I've been wanting to meet you. I'm Catherine Voss." The name registered something in Emma's peripheral memory. She had heard it once, briefly, in a conversation between Marcus and Dara 2 days ago that had stopped when she entered the room.
"Mrs. Voss," Emma said. "Lovely to meet you."
"The pleasure is mine. We were all so surprised to hear about Alexander's marriage. He's been very private for so many years." Catherine Voss tilted her head. "You must be extraordinary to have changed that."
"Or just well-timed," Emma said lightly. Catherine laughed. It sounded genuine enough that Emma almost trusted it.
Almost. "I wanted to reach out personally," Catherine continued, lowering her voice just slightly, creating the artificial intimacy of a confidence, "because I think you deserve to know the kind of man you've married, not the version he presents publicly."
Emma kept her expression friendly, and her shoulders relaxed.
"I think most of us are different publicly and privately." "Of course, but some differences are more significant than others." Catherine's eyes moved briefly across the room to Alexander. "His first business partner died in a warehouse fire 6 years ago. The investigation was closed. Did he mention that?"
The words were designed to land hard and fast, and they did. Emma felt them in her chest like a small impact. But she had been managed before by experts. She knew what a planted thought looked like when it was being inserted. She smiled.
"I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Voss. Truly."
"I have contacts in the DA's office," Catherine said. "People who are building something quite substantial. When the time comes, and it will come, you might want to have already been on the correct side of things." She pressed a business card into Emma's hand with the smooth finality of a woman who had delivered this particular speech before. "Think of it as a friendly introduction." The same phrase the man at Harrow and Stone had used. Emma looked at the card. Then she looked up at Catherine Voss with the clearest, most untroubled expression she could manufacture. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Catherine stood, smoothed her gown, and moved back into the crowd with the unhurried ease of someone who had just accomplished what she'd come to do. Alexander appeared at Emma's side 40 seconds later. He didn't sit. He picked up his glass from the table and said, without looking at her, "How long did she have with you?"
"Less than 3 minutes."
"What did she say?"
"That your first business partner died in a warehouse fire, and the investigation was closed."
Emma set the business card on the table between them.
"And that she has contacts in the DA's office building. Something substantial."
Something tightened in Alexander's jaw. Just briefly. Gone before it fully arrived. "We're leaving," he said.
"Now?"
"Now." They were in the car within 5 minutes. Not rushed. Alexander moved through rooms the same way regardless, at his own tempo. But deliberately, efficiently, with Dara materializing from somewhere and flanking Emma's left side in a way that only became apparent to Emma afterward, when she understood that Dara had been tracking both Catherine Voss and the man near the back of the room simultaneously, and had already moved to intercept the latter before they'd reached the exit. In the car, silence for a full minute. The city slid past the windows in ribbons of light. Then Alexander said, "The fire. You want to ask about it?"
"Yes,"
Emma said. He was quiet for another moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of someone who had long since finished grieving something and was now simply carrying the shape of it. "His name was David Reyes. He was my partner for 4 years. The fire was set deliberately by a man named Petrov, the same Petrov whose people approached you at Harrow and Stone." He paused. "David didn't make it out. I did. And Petrov has spent the 6 years since then constructing a version of events where I'm responsible." Emma listened to the rain beginning against the car windows.
"Catherine Voss works for Petrov," she said. It wasn't a question.
"Yes."
She sat with that.
"Then, and the DA contact she mentioned?"
Real, Alexander said quietly, which is why you being here matters more than I initially explained. He turned to look at her then, fully, directly, in a way he rarely did. You're not just a detail in an arrangement anymore, Emma. You're a target. I should have told you sooner. I'm telling you now. The car moved through the dark Chicago streets. Emma looked at the business card still in her hand and thought about what it meant to be standing in someone else's crossfire, and what it meant that, knowing this, she still didn't want to leave. That thought frightened her more than Catherine Voss ever could. The lake house was not what she expected. After the estate's calculated grandeur and the penthouse's deliberate emptiness, Emma had braced for more of the same, another space designed to project power rather than inhabit it. Instead, the car turned down a narrow road through pine trees and stopped in front of a low, timber-framed house sitting directly at the edge of a gray winter lake. Modest by Alexander Kane's apparent standards, human-scaled. The kind of place that had a stone fireplace and wooden bookshelves and a kitchen that looked like it had actually been cooked in. It looked, startlingly, like somewhere a person went to rest. "This is yours?" Emma asked, stepping out into air that was cold and clean and smelled of pine and water. "My father built it," Alexander said, already carrying her bag to the door. "He was very different from what I became." He said it without self-pity or drama, just as a fact he had made peace with at some point and no longer needed to examine. But Emma heard the weight underneath it and stored it carefully, the way she had learned to store everything he let slip. Dara and the security team were stationed in a separate structure further back from the house, present but invisible, which Emma was beginning to understand was Dara's preferred mode of operation. The lake house itself held only the two of them, which was, Emma realized, the first time that had been true. The first evening was careful. They moved around each other with the particular consideration of people who were used to keeping their distance and were now operating in a space that didn't allow for it. Emma made tea. Alexander lit the fire. They sat on opposite ends of a long couch with a silence between them that was not unfriendly, but was still measured. Outside, the lake was perfectly still and steel gray under a cloudy sky, and the pine trees stood like dark sentinels along the shore. There was no traffic noise, no city hum, just the occasional crack of the fire and the sound of wind moving through branches. "Catherine Voss," Emma said eventually. "Has she tried this before? Turning someone close to you?" "3 times, Alexander said. My previous lawyer, a man who worked in my financial office, and a woman He stopped, corrected the sentence's direction. "Someone in my personal life, 4 years ago." Emma heard what the correction was covering and chose not to press it. Not yet. "Did it work?" she asked instead. "The lawyer took the approach. Gave Petrov information that cost me 2 legitimate contracts and nearly a licensing agreement." A pause. "The other 2 didn't." "What happened to the lawyer?" "He moved to Seattle," Alexander said, with an evenness that somehow made Seattle sound final. "He's fine. I'm not in the business of hurting people who make frightened choices." Emma looked at him sideways. "That surprises me." "Most things about me seem to." "Because you let people assume the worst and don't correct them." He looked at the fire. "The worst keeps people at a safe distance. Corrections invite complications." Emma turned to face him more directly. "That's not a way to live. That's a defense mechanism with a property portfolio." The almost smile, fainter than usual. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about me in years." She pulled her knees up and watched the fire. "Tell me about the health condition," she said. "You mentioned it once, briefly, in the context of long-term attachment being risky." The silence that followed was different from the others. Not guarded exactly, but load-bearing, like a wall that had been holding something up for a long time. "How did you?" he started. "You said it in the car after the gala. Matters more than I initially explained. And before that, at the lake house door, you said your father was very different from what you became." She watched him.
People who talk about their parents in the past tense and describe themselves as a departure from that original version usually had a specific moment that changed them. The health thing is connected. He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. The lake sat still and dark beyond the windows.
"It's a cardiac condition," he said finally. "Inherited. My father had it. His father before him." His voice was steady in the way that meant it had cost him something to make it so. "It's managed, has been for years, but the prognosis past 50 is uncertain, at best."
Emma absorbed this. "How old are you?"
37.
"That gives you—"
13 years, on the optimistic side," he said. "Or less. Or perhaps more. Medicine changes. Bodies surprise people."
He said it practically, clinically, the tone of someone who had long since finished panicking and moved into maintenance mode.
"But it means that inviting someone into a permanent version of my life is—"
"A kindness you decided not to perform," Emma finished.
He glanced at her sharply.
"Because you thought it was generous," she said, "keeping people out, protecting them from the ending before the middle even begins."
"Isn't it?"
"No," Emma said, with a directness that surprised even her. "It's control. You decided for other people what they could handle, and you dressed it up as protection."
She paused, making sure her voice stayed level and not unkind.
"I know what it feels like to have someone decide what you're worth without asking you first."
The words sat between them in the firelight. Alexander didn't respond immediately. He looked at his hands, then at the window, then at some middle distance that held whatever it was he was sorting through. "The woman 4 years ago," he said quietly. "The one I didn't name earlier." Emma waited. "Her name was Sophia. She knew the condition. She said it didn't matter." He paused. "She was working for a rival organization for most of the time I knew her. What I thought was intimacy was intelligence gathering." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "When I found out, she had already left the country. I had given her access to things I had never given anyone access to."
Emma said nothing, the kind of nothing that meant, "I'm still here, keep going."
"I decided afterward that I was better suited to arrangements than to attachments," he said. "Arrangements have terms. Attachments have gaps, and people find their way into the gaps."
"So you became a man with no gaps?"
"I became a man who managed his gaps carefully."
"And yet," Emma said softly, "here you are, at your father's lake house, in the middle of a weekend that wasn't on any security schedule, telling me about a cardiac condition you've probably told 3 people in your entire life."
He looked at her then, really looked, the kind that didn't calculate or measure, but just landed, full weight, and stayed. "You're very difficult to maintain distance from," he said. It sounded like an admission he hadn't planned to make.
"Good," Emma said. "Distance is overrated."
Outside, without warning, it began to snow. Light, early winter snow, the tentative kind, feeling its way down through the dark air and landing soundlessly on the surface of the lake. They both saw it at the same moment, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. It was Alexander who moved first, not toward her, just to the window, standing with one hand in his pocket and watching the snow begin to cover the dock. "My father used to say this lake was the only honest thing he owned," he said quietly. "Everything else had a price or a purpose, but the lake just was." Emma came to stand beside him, not close enough to touch, just close enough that the gap between them was no longer a strategy.
"I think you're more like him than you've let yourself believe,"
she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't move away either, and that, Emma was learning, was Alexander Kane's version of agreement. The snow fell steadily now, quiet and indifferent and beautiful, covering everything that had been hard and cold and defended, at least for tonight. Tomorrow, the danger would still be there. Petrov's network, Catherine Voss's business card, the legal machinery grinding somewhere in the city they had temporarily escaped. But tonight, in his father's lake house with a fire going and the snow coming down, something between them had cracked open slightly. Not broken, but opened.
and the light getting through it was small and fragile, and neither of them moved to close it. Emma stood at the window and realized she wasn't performing anything anymore. That was either the best thing that had happened in years, or the most dangerous. Knowing this situation, it was probably both.
She hadn't told Alexander where she was going. That was the first mistake, and she knew it even as she made it. But something about this particular errand felt like it needed to be hers alone, untouched by the machinery of his world, unwitnessed, private in the way that only the most personal things need to be. She told Dara she was going to the estate's on-site gym. She took the secondary exit that she'd identified on day 3, the one with a camera angle that swept right instead of left. She flagged a cab 2 streets from the gate. She told herself she'd be back within 2 hours. The clinic was called Lakeview Women's Medical Center, a clean, mid-sized facility in Lincoln Park that Emma had never visited. Her own fertility records were held at Meridian Clinic across the city, the one she and Daniel had attended together for 3 years. She wasn't going there. She was going here, to a doctor named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had been recommended by a women's health forum Emma had found at 2 a.m. on her 4th night at the estate when she couldn't sleep and her mind kept returning to the same locked door. The door that said, "What if the diagnosis wasn't real?" It had started as a whisper, a half-formed thought she kept dismissing because it felt too convenient, too self-serving, the kind of story a woman tells herself to survive something unbearable. But the whisper had grown legs over the past week, fed by small things she kept noticing in retrospect. The way Daniel had always attended consultations alone with the doctor first, saying he was confirming appointment details. The way the test results were always presented by email rather than discussed in person. The way Daniel's mother had seemed not devastated by the diagnosis, but relieved, as though it confirmed something she had already known. Dr. Osei was a small, precise woman with reading glasses and the manner of someone who had heard a great many difficult things and taken all of them seriously. Emma laid out what she had: copies of her original test results she'd kept on her personal email, her full medical history, the timeline of treatment. She explained what she suspected without dramatizing it. Dr. Osei listened. Then she examined the documents with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they knew well. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Emma's hands tightened in her lap. "Mrs. Dr. Osei started. "Carter," Emma said. "Emma Carter." "Ms. Carter." The doctor removed her glasses. "These results have been interpreted selectively. The hormone panel here," she pointed to a specific column of figures, "indicates reduced ovarian reserve, yes, but the degree to which this was characterized as definitive infertility is not supported by these numbers. This is a challenging fertility profile. It is not a closed case." Emma stared at her. "Furthermore," Dr. Osei continued, in the careful voice of someone handing over something fragile, "there is no record here of your husband's own fertility assessment. In standard protocol, both partners are tested simultaneously. It's medically illogical to assign a conclusive diagnosis based on one partner's results alone." The room was very quiet. "You're saying he was never tested," Emma said. "I'm saying there's no documentation of it, which means either the records were not shared with you," the doctor paused, deliberate, "or they do not exist." Emma thought about Daniel's private first meetings with the doctor, the emailed results, his mother's relief. "Is it possible," she said slowly, "for a man to know he has a fertility condition and conceal it from his wife by directing blame onto her instead?" Dr. Osei held her gaze steadily. "It is possible. It requires a cooperative physician and deliberate omission. It is not common, but in cases I've encountered over 20 years, it is not unheard of." The room tilted slightly. Emma breathed through it. 3 years. 3 years of injections and waiting rooms and the slow erosion of her sense of herself as a whole person. 3 years of Daniel's disappointment, performed so convincingly she had absorbed it as truth. 3 years of his mother's barely concealed contempt, all of it pointing at Emma, all of it landing on Emma,
while the actual answer sat buried in a file that had never been shown to her. She had not been infertile. She had been framed. She left the clinic 40 minutes later, carrying a copy of Dr. Osei's assessment and the particular kind of anger that doesn't arrive loudly, the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes structural. She needed air. She walked. The street outside was busy for a Tuesday, lunch hour foot traffic, a bus idling at the corner, a food cart sending steam into the cold air. Emma walked south with her hands in her coat pockets and her mind working through the implications in sequence. The diagnosis was manipulated. Daniel knew. He had her thrown out of a life built on a lie, and somewhere in the city he was currently continuing that life with the clean conscience of a man who had never been held accountable for a single deliberate thing. She was so deep inside that thought that she almost didn't notice the van. It was gray, unremarkable, parked half a block ahead with its engine running, which meant either a delivery or someone waiting. Her feet registered the wrongness before her mind did, slowing her stride slightly. The back doors opened. 2 men moved fast, not running, which would have drawn attention, but closing the distance between them and her with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. One moved to her left, cutting off the sidewalk. The other came from behind. Emma had exactly 2 seconds to make a choice. She didn't freeze. She pivoted right, stepped off the curb into the street, and screamed. Not a frightened scream, but a deliberate, shattering noise aimed at volume and attention. A passing driver leaned on his horn. People turned. The man behind her grabbed her arm. What happened next took approximately 8 seconds. A black SUV she hadn't seen parked across the street, accelerated hard and cut diagonally across traffic, stopping between Emma and the van with a screech that drew every eye on the block. 2 of Alexander's security team were out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. The man holding Emma's arm released it and stepped back. The second man was already retreating. The van's doors slammed. It was over before most bystanders had processed what they'd witnessed. Dara appeared at Emma's side from what seemed like nowhere, one hand on her arm, steering her toward the SUV with firm, controlled speed. "I told you," Dara started. "I know," Emma said. "The gym. You said the gym." "I know, Dara." She was put in the car. The door closed. The convoy moved. Emma sat with her hands in her lap and noticed they were steady, which surprised her. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were still, as if some part of her had already decided this was no longer the worst thing that had happened to her this month. Then the door on the opposite side opened, and Alexander got in. He must have been in the lead vehicle. He said nothing immediately, just looked at her face with the focused attention of someone running a rapid systems check. She wasn't bleeding. She wasn't shaking. She was intact. He exhaled slowly. "You followed me," she said. "Dara did," he said. "When she found the gym empty, she tracked the phone." He paused. "You switched the camera." "I noticed the angle on day 3. Something moved across his expression, not quite admiration, complicated by the anger underneath it. "Those weren't Petrov's men," Dara said from the front seat, without turning around. Emma looked up. "What?" "The plates, the van's model, the approach formation." Dara's voice was flat and precise. "That's Victor Hale's crew, Petrov's rival, which means someone told Hale you were at that clinic today, and the only people who knew your movements," she paused, "were the ones already inside our network." The car went silent. Emma felt the shape of it land fully, not just the abduction attempt, not just the mole in Alexander's operation, but the complete picture of what the morning had given her. A 3-year lie dismantled in a clinic room. A van with 2 men and deliberate hands. A leak somewhere inside the only protection she had. She turned to Alexander. "I found something at the clinic," she said, "about my diagnosis." Her voice didn't break. She had decided it wouldn't. Daniel knew he was the one with the condition. The infertility was his. He concealed it and redirected it onto me. For 3 years. Alexander was very still.
I need you to understand something, Emma said, and her voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not fragile, not angry, but resolved. Iron resolved. The kind that forms when something has been tested enough times that it stops bending. I am done being the person things happen to. Whoever is leaking information, whoever sent that van, whatever Petrov and Hale and Catherine Voss are building, I'm not standing at the edge of this anymore. She met his eyes directly. Tell me everything. All of it. No more managed versions. Alexander looked at her for a long, waited moment. The city moved past the windows. Then he said, "When we get back." It wasn't a deflection. It was a door opening. Emma nodded and looked back out at the street. She was no longer a woman surviving a marriage she'd been discarded from. She wasn't entirely sure what she was becoming yet, but it was something with teeth. He told her everything. Not all at once. It came in pieces over the course of the evening they returned from the clinic, Alexander talking and Emma listening across the kitchen island with cold coffee between them, and the estate security doing a full sweep of the grounds outside. It was the most words she had heard him say consecutively, and she understood instinctively that this was not something he did often, perhaps ever. The empire, as people called it, had started as something almost legitimate. Logistics, distribution, contract negotiation across industries that operated in gray legal territory but not criminal ones. His father had built the foundation. Alexander had expanded it, and in expanding it had crossed lines that, once crossed, don't uncross. Not because he was careless, but because the world on that side of the line had specific gravity, and walking away from it required resources and leverage that kept being just out of reach. Petrov had been trying to acquire Alexander's operations for 6 years. Not destroy them, acquire them. Take over the network, the contracts, the relationships built over decades. The legal pressure was real. The DA involvement was real. And Catherine Voss was not just Petrov's messenger. She was his legal architect, a former federal prosecutor who had built 3 successful asset seizure cases and was now constructing a 4th with Alexander's name on it. Victor Hale was something different. Not interested in acquisition, interested in elimination. Hale had wanted Alexander's Chicago territory for 2 years, and while Petrov tried to dismantle him through courts and leverage, Hale preferred simpler methods. The van outside the clinic had been Hale's opening move. "And the mall," Emma said. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Marcus is running it, quietly. We've narrowed it to 3 people with access to your movements." "When will you know which one?" "Soon," he said, and something in the way he said it made her not ask for specifics. She had gone to bed that night with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been handed too much truth in one day and needs sleep simply to have somewhere to put it. Day 15 arrived without warning and without mercy. She was in the library at 9 in the morning, genuinely reading this time, an architecture journal she'd found on the lower shelf, when every security light in the estate switched to red simultaneously. Not a drill. The estate had done 2 drills in the 12 days she'd been here, and they used amber. Red was real. Dara appeared in the doorway within seconds, already in motion. "We need to move you to the interior room, now." "What's happening?" "Alexander's warehouse facility on the south side. They hit it 40 minutes ago. Hale's people, coordinated, 3 entry points simultaneously." Dara's voice was completely controlled, which was somehow more alarming than if she had sounded afraid. "It's contained, but he went in personally, which means—" "He's there now," Emma said. "He's there now." Something cold moved through Emma's chest. "Take me there." Dara looked at her the way people look at statements they cannot believe they've heard. "Absolutely not." "Dara!" "My job is to keep you safe. Alexander's explicit instruction in any active situation is that you are to be secured, not—" "Your job," Emma said, standing up, "is also to use judgment.
and your judgment, if you'll actually apply it, should tell you that sitting me in an interior room while everything burns down is not a strategy. It's a storage solution. She held Dara's gaze. How bad is it? A pause, the kind that already contained the answer. Bad, Dara said. Then take me there. The warehouse was a vast industrial building near the rail yards, legitimate on paper, a distribution center for 3 separate contracted businesses. By the time Emma arrived with Dara and 4 security personnel, the external situation had been physically resolved, but its wreckage hadn't. Hale's crew had come in through coordinated vehicle breaches, 2 truck rams at separate loading doors, a 3rd team through a maintenance access point they should not have known existed. The mole had given them the layout. Inside, the damage was significant. Equipment destroyed, 2 of Alexander's men injured, neither critically but visibly, sitting against a wall being attended to while Marcus Webb moved through the space on the phone with the clipped urgency of a man trying to prevent several disasters at once. Emma found Alexander in the center of the warehouse floor. He was standing still, which was the first thing she noticed, because still was wrong. He was a man of controlled motion, always positioned, always composed. This stillness was different. This was the aftermath of something. His knuckles were split. There was a cut above his eyebrow she was certain he hadn't noticed. And he was looking at the destroyed interior of a facility that represented years of built infrastructure, with the expression of a man deciding what to do with a fury he had nowhere appropriate to put. He saw her, and something shifted in his face. Not relief, but close to it, wrapped in something more immediate. "Why are you here?" His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. "Because you were here." "I told Dara—" "I overruled her," Emma said. "Don't take it out on her." "Emma." He stepped closer, lowered his voice further. "This is not where you should be right now. There are still—" "I know what there still is," she said. "I know this isn't over, and I know Hale's people might regroup, and I know the mole is still unidentified, and all of that is true." She held her ground. "And I'm still here." "I'm trying to protect you." "I know." She said it simply, without anger. "But you're doing the thing again, deciding what I can handle, making choices about my exposure without asking me what I can tolerate." She kept her voice even, steady, not a confrontation but a correction. "I am not someone you protect by removing. I am someone you protect by standing beside. There is a difference." He looked at her. The cut above his eyebrow was tracking a thin line of blood he still hadn't registered. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "You don't know. You haven't touched it." He hadn't. She was right. She stepped forward and pressed the sleeve of her own jacket carefully to the cut. It was such a practical, unthought gesture that neither of them commented on it. He didn't move away. "I know who the mole is," Emma said quietly. He stilled. "Marcus's assistant, Elena." She kept pressure on the cut. "I noticed it on day 4. She always positioned herself in hallways after internal meetings, and she has a habit of repeating phrasing, exact phrasing, from conversations she shouldn't have been present for. I thought I was being paranoid." She paused. "I wasn't being paranoid." Alexander turned his head slightly, carefully, given her hand was still at his eyebrow. "You've been sitting on that." "I was waiting until I was certain. Today confirmed it. She knew I was going to the clinic. She was the only person who heard me tell Dara I was going to the gym, because she was at the end of that corridor." The silence that followed was significant. Then Marcus appeared from across the warehouse floor, phone lowered, expression set. "Kane, we have a problem." "Elena," Alexander said. Marcus stopped, looked at Emma, looked back at Alexander. "She's gone," Marcus said. "Her apartment was cleared out an hour ago." The warehouse was quiet except for the distant sound of sirens somewhere in the city outside, and the ambient hum of the one remaining functioning overhead light. Alexander stepped back slightly, looked at Emma, really looked, the way that had become its own specific language between them, and then said to Marcus, "Lock everything down.
New codes, new sweep, new security protocols by tonight. He paused. And find her. Marcus nodded and moved. Then Alexander turned to Dara. Take Emma to the penthouse. Not the estate. Petrov knows the layout now, too.
And you? Emma asked.
I'll be there in 2 hours.
1, Emma said. Something crossed his face, the almost smile arriving at possibly the least appropriate moment, which somehow made it feel more honest than any other time she'd seen it. 1, he agreed. He arrived in 58 minutes. Emma had made coffee she didn't drink and stood at the penthouse window, watching the city and trying not to watch the clock. When she heard the elevator and then his key code, something in her chest unwound with a speed she hadn't expected. He came in. He sat at the kitchen counter. He accepted the coffee she slid across without comment. They sat together without speaking for a while. The city glittered 40 floors below them, indifferent and enormous, and lit up like it didn't know what had happened today. Which it didn't. Which was the thing about cities. They contained multitudes of private catastrophes and kept right on glittering. It's not just a contract anymore, Alexander said finally. Emma looked at him.
This. He gestured between them, not dramatically, just a simple acknowledgement. Whatever this has been, since that first night, it's not what I designed it to be.
No, Emma agreed. It isn't.
I don't know what to do with that, he said, with a frankness that was so unguarded it almost startled her. A man who controlled every variable in every room he entered, admitting plainly that this one had slipped outside the frame.
You don't have to do anything with it tonight, Emma said. Tonight, you drink the coffee and let the cut on your face close, and we figure out the rest tomorrow.
He looked at her across the counter. You're remarkably calm for someone who was nearly abducted 3 days ago and was just in an active situation involving violent entry and structural damage.
I'm furious, Emma said pleasantly. I'm just organized about it.
The almost smile became, for the first time, a full one, brief, real. It changed his face completely, made him look his age for a moment, made him look like someone who existed before the Empire and the Condition and Sophia and Petrov and all the rest of the architecture of defense he lived inside.
Emma stored that away too. Except this time it didn't feel like intelligence gathering. It felt like knowing someone. Outside, Chicago went on doing what Chicago did. And inside the penthouse, something that had started as a transaction and slowly, stubbornly, against both their intentions, become something else entirely, settled quietly into its new shape. Not finished, not safe, not simple, but chosen. And that, Emma was learning, was the only kind of thing worth having. The threat ended on a Thursday, not with an explosion or a confrontation or anything that matched the magnitude of what had preceded it. That was the thing about dangerous situations. They rarely concluded the way they arrived. They unraveled, thread by thread, pressure point by pressure point, until the structure that had held them in place simply had nothing left to grip. Elena had been found in Milwaukee, 48 hours after disappearing. Not by Alexander's people, by Marcus, who had a contact in federal law enforcement that owed him something old and significant. She was already talking, trading everything she knew about Petrov's operation for arrangement that kept her out of a cell, which meant that by Thursday morning, the DA's office had a problem. The case Catherine Voss had spent 18 months constructing was built substantially on information sourced from an operative who was now cooperating with the other side and recanting the framing she had helped engineer. The asset seizure case collapsed in a closed session that afternoon. Petrov left Chicago by private flight that evening, destination unconfirmed.
Catherine Voss's name appeared on a federal inquiry list by the following morning, which was the kind of conclusion that satisfied Marcus and Dara enormously, and which Emma received with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had watched the pieces move long enough to recognize the end of the game.
Victor Hale, without Petrov's legal cover and with 2 of his own associates now in federal custody following the warehouse attack, went silent. The kind of silence that meant reassessment rather than retreat, but also the kind that bought time. Enough time. Marcus delivered the summary in the penthouse library. Emma sat beside Alexander at the long table, not behind him, not across from him, and noticed that neither of them had commented on the seating arrangement. When Marcus finished, he closed his folder and looked at Alexander. "It's over," he said. "For now." "For now," Alexander agreed. Marcus glanced at Emma, a brief, specific look that carried something she hadn't seen in it before. Respect, perhaps, or its close cousin, revised assessment. Then he left. Alexander told her that evening. They were on the penthouse terrace, which in November required coats and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who wanted open air badly enough to tolerate the cold. The city spread below them in every direction, all light and motion and the endless churn of a place that never fully stopped. "I want to dissolve the contract," he said. Emma turned to look at him. "The legal threat is neutralized. The reason we entered this arrangement no longer requires your participation." He said it evenly, but she had learned his voice well enough now to hear what lived underneath the evenness. Something careful, something that was bracing. "You should be free. That was always the point." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "Alexander, you have the account. It's yours regardless. I want to be clear about that. And Dara will maintain a security presence for another 3 months as a precaution. But you don't need to be here. You don't need to be my wife. You never needed to be anything other than—" "Alexander," she said again, quieter. He stopped. "You're doing it again," she said. A pause. "What?" "Deciding for me." She kept her voice gentle because this was not a moment for sharpness. "You've built a very elegant exit for me. You've made it clean and fair and financially sound, which is exactly the kind of gesture a man makes when he's trying to be noble and is also terrified." She watched him. "Am I wrong?" He was quiet for long enough that the answer was in the silence. "You have a life to rebuild," he said finally. "A real one. A practice, a career, everything you set aside. You were thrown out of a life built on a lie, and you deserve to construct something entirely yours." He paused. "I am complicated. My world is complicated. You've spent 3 weeks inside it, and it has included an abduction attempt and a warehouse attack and a mole in my own security team." He turned to look at her directly. "Why would you choose this?" "I'm not choosing this," Emma said. "I'm choosing you. Those aren't the same thing." He absorbed that. She could see him working against it, the old machinery engaging, the long-practiced instinct to build the wall back up, to cite the cardiac condition or the danger or the impossibility of guarantees. She watched him reach for those arguments and then, slowly, set them down. "The condition," he started, "is real," she said, "and I know about it, fully. And I'm still standing on this roof in November in a coat that isn't warm enough, having this conversation, so perhaps factor that into your risk assessment." "Emma." "You told me the lake was the only honest thing your father owned," she said. "Because it just was. No price, no purpose." She held his gaze. "That's what this is. I'm not here because of an arrangement. I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I have places to go. I have an account and 3 months of security and a career I intend to rebuild regardless." She paused. "I'm here because this is where I want to be, and that is the only currency I'm offering." The city hummed 40 floors below them. Alexander looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the calculating look, not the almost smile, not the guarded flatness he wore in rooms full of people who wanted things from him. This was something stripped of all of that, unperformed.
Simply a man standing in the cold on a roof, looking at a woman who had walked into his car 3 weeks ago with $42 and a broken suitcase, and had somehow, entirely without permission, made herself necessary. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The admission was so plain, so unguarded, that it cost him something visible to make it. "Neither do I," Emma said. "I spent 6 years in a marriage that was a performance. I have no idea what the real version looks like." She allowed a small, genuine smile. "But I think it starts with 2 people on a roof, being honest, and deciding to figure it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just picked it up the way you pick up something you intend to keep. His hand was warm despite the cold, and his grip was careful. The same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, except this time it wasn't a strategy. It was just him. Emma held on. They stood there for a long time without speaking, watching the city below. All those lit windows, all those separate lives running parallel to each other without intersection. The ordinary miracle of a city that contained multitudes and never ran out of room for another beginning. Emma thought about the woman she had been 3 weeks ago, standing in the rain with a broken suitcase and the wreckage of a life built on someone else's lie, crying on a pavement because she had finally run out of places to hold it. She didn't feel sorry for that woman. She felt something more useful, a kind of clear-eyed recognition, the understanding that the end of that story had not been a destruction, it had been an excavation. She thought about Daniel and found, with some surprise, that the anger had settled into something quieter. Not forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she was, but a kind of release. He had taken 3 years from her with a lie, and she had spent 20 days building something realer than anything he had offered. Whatever accounting the universe kept, she was no longer on the losing side of it. She thought about Dr. Osei's words. "This is a challenging fertility profile. It is not a closed case." She had not told Alexander this part yet. She had held it privately, turning it over, waiting until it felt like hers to share rather than a revelation to perform. Somewhere in the future, not tonight, not yet, she would, and she would see what he did with it. She suspected, having learned to read him across 3 weeks of careful attention, that he would do something unexpected with it, something that would make her revise her estimates of him upward again, which had been happening with reliable frequency. Beside her, Alexander turned slightly. "What are you thinking?" "That I want to open my practice," she said. "Here, in Chicago. I want to design buildings that matter to people who don't have a great deal of money to spend on things mattering." She paused. "And that I want a dog." He looked at her. "A dog?" "The estate has grounds. It would be practical." "We have a security operation." "Dogs are excellent security." A pause. Then, with the very specific effort of a man dismantling his own resistance in real time, "What kind of dog?" Emma turned to look at him fully, this complicated, guarded, quietly generous, genuinely dangerous, and unexpectedly tender man who had opened a car door in the rain and changed the entire direction of her life. She smiled, a real one, the kind she had forgotten she was capable of. "We'll figure it out," she said. He looked at her, and the full smile came again, the one that changed his face, that made him look like the person he had always been underneath the empire and the defense and the carefully managed distance. It stayed longer this time. "Yes," Alexander Kane said quietly, looking out at the city that had once belonged only to his world, and now, for the first time, contained something that was genuinely his. "We will." Below them, Chicago glittered on, indifferent, enormous, and entirely unaware that somewhere on its 40th floor, 2 people who had each survived their own kind of erasure had found, in the most unlikely arrangement imaginable, the most honest thing either of them had ever owned.